The blizzard's grip. The old woman, Mrs. Gable, coughed, a rattling, wet sound that echoed in the small clinic. Elara listened to her lungs with the stethoscope. The cold metal, a sharp contrast to the woman's feverish skin. "Sounds a bit worse today, Mrs. Gable. But don't you fret, we'll get you breathing easier." She scribbled on the prescription pad, tearing it off with a practiced flick of the wrist. "More fluids, this medication 3 times a day, and stay bundled up nice and warm." "That's an order." Mrs. Gable managed a weak smile, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Always looking after everyone, aren't you, Elara? Even when you're run ragged yourself." Elara laughed, a light, airy sound. "Someone has to. Besides, you do the same for me." She helped the woman into her heavy coat, the wind already howling outside, a mournful prelude to the storm. The wind had been picking up all morning, a persistent whine that vibrated through the wooden walls of the clinic. Now, as Elara watched Mrs. Gable slowly navigate the path towards her home, the first fat snowflakes began to fall, swirling like restless spirits. By the time she'd locked the clinic door, the snow was coming down in earnest, a white curtain obliterating the mountains. Inside, the clinic felt suddenly small, isolated. Elara stoked the fire in the potbelly stove, the flames licking greedily at the dry wood. She glanced at the window. Visibility was down to near zero. The storm was here. She made a pot of tea, the fragrant steam rising to warm her face. As she sipped the tea, a shiver ran down her spine, not from the cold, but from a feeling of unease. It was more than just a storm. It felt malevolent. She tried to shake it off, attributing it to the fatigue that clung to her like a second skin. The hours crawled by. The wind intensified, rattling the windows and whistling through the cracks in the walls. The power flickered, then died, plunging the clinic into near darkness, save for the flickering glow of the fire. Elara lit a kerosene lamp, its soft light casting long, dancing shadows. Just as she was beginning to feel truly alone, the old crank telephone on the wall buzzed, a jarring sound that cut through the storm's fury. She practically leaped for it. "Metasuite Clinic," she said, her voice tight with anticipation. The voice on the other end was frantic, barely audible above the static and the howling wind. It was Martha, one of the ranchers from up north. "Elara, thank God you're there, it's Jed. Jed Stone, he's been hurt bad." "Jed? What happened? Where are you?" Elara gripped the receiver tightly, her heart pounding. "Tree fell during the storm. Hit him, out near the north pasture. Can't move him. Need help, please." The line crackled and faded. "Elara, please," then silence. Elara slammed the receiver down, her mind racing. Jed Stone, injured, out in this blizzard. He wouldn't survive long. She threw on her warmest coat, a thick wool thing that had belonged to her grandfather. It smelled of wood smoke and pine needles, a comforting scent that did little to ease her rising panic. She pulled on her boots, laced them tight. The wind hit her like a physical force when she opened the clinic door. Snow swirled around her, stinging her face, blinding her. The world had become a chaotic white void. She could barely see her hand in front of her face. She knew the risks. Going out in this storm was dangerous, possibly suicidal. But she also knew Jed. He was gruff, often difficult, but underneath that tough exterior was a good man. And he needed her. Taking a deep breath, Elara stepped out into the blizzard's grip. The first step was the hardest, a plunge into the unknown. The snow was already knee-deep, and the wind threatened to rip her off her feet. But she pushed on, her eyes fixed on the vague direction of the Stone Ranch, her mind filled with the image of Jed, lying injured and alone in the unforgiving snow. The clinic door slammed shut behind her, swallowed by the white fury, leaving her alone against the storm. A cowboy's cry. The wind shrieked like a tormented spirit, battering the cabin and vibrating the window panes. Elara trod heavily on the rug. The name, Jed, a silent prayer escaping her lips. Marty's worry had been a palpable thing, a tremor in his voice when he'd spoken. Jed was isolated, his ranch a lonely outpost even in good weather, and this storm was anything but. A glance at her dwindling stores, the flour low, the jerky almost depleted, underscored the stakes. Venture out, and she risked her own safety, depleting precious resources. Stay put, and Jed might face the full brunt of the tempest, injured and alone. Forehead pressed to the icy glass, she watched the swirling white devour the landscape. Her conscience wrestled with the choice. A hesitant knock. Marty shuffled in, his face a roadmap of hard living and present concern. "That Jed's a mule," he rasped. "Always has been. Orphan young. He carve a life out there. Relies on no one." Elara swung around, questioning etched on her face. "Why this silence?" Marty sighed, raking a hand through his thinning hair. Seemed unimportant. Jed hoards himself, but he's a solid man, Elara. Gruff but decent. Pride chokes him before he asks for aid, even now. He paused, his eyes finding hers. That land, it's a trial. Tried his hand at cattle, but the weather bleeds him dry. He's weathered his share of hardship, seen too much erased. A jolt of empathy, sharp and unexpected, pierced Elara. She understood loneliness, the burden of insurmountable odds. She recognized the gut-wrenching fear of watching your life's work dissolve. He'll be out of kindling before long. Marty's voice was a thread against the storm's fury. And that leg, if it festers. The unspoken threat hung heavy. Elara squared her shoulders, resolve firm. "I'm going." Marty nodded, a spark of hope in his gaze. "Knew you would. Borrow my warmest parka. And this." He offered a flask of strong coffee, laced with something reeking faintly of whiskey. "Might need it." Elara donned layers, her movements purposeful and efficient. She packed her medical kit, adding extra supplies. She divided what little food remained, sealing it in a waterproof pouch. Compass, knife, hatchet, she checked each item, the urgency lending speed to her actions. The wind roared with renewed ferocity as she wrenched open the door, a solid curtain of snow slamming into her. Scar pushed tight, she squinted against the blinding white. The world was gone, consumed by the tempest. Each step felt like a contest against the gale, the snow a clinging weight on her boots. She tracked the obscured path, hand outstretched, groping through the whiteout. The ranch lay miles distant, a phantom in the swirling chaos. Doubt gnawed, whispering temptations of retreat. Was she strong enough? Was this the right call? What if she strayed from the path? What if she was too late? But the vision of Jed, stranded and hurting, banished the hesitation, replaced by a fierce resolve. No turning back. No falling. One step at a time, she pressed onward into the storm's core, a small beacon against nature's wrath. The cowboy needed rescuing, and she was on her way. Ranch under siege. The wind howled like a banshee, tearing at Elara as she wrestled the ranch gate open. Snow, thick and blinding, swirled around her, each flake a tiny icy dagger. The ranch house loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the raging white. No lights, no smoke curling from a chimney. A knot of dread tightened in Elara's stomach. She found him sprawled halfway through the doorway, one leg twisted at an unnatural angle. His face was ashen, lips blue. "Jed," she shouted, her voice barely audible above the storm. He groaned, a sound that was swallowed by the wind. He was alive, at least. Getting him inside was a Herculean effort. Elara, fueled by adrenaline, managed to drag him further into the house, his dead weight a terrible burden. The interior was frigid, the air thick with the smell of dust and stale wood. She found a tattered blanket in a nearby trunk and wrapped it around him, though it offered little warmth. "Legs broken, I reckon," he mumbled, his eyes fluttering open. He tried to sit up, wincing in pain. "Damn horse threw me." Elara pressed him back down gently but firmly. "Stay still, Jed. You're going into shock." She needed to assess the situation, and fast. The ranch was woefully unprepared. A meager stack of firewood sat beside the cold hearth. The pantry revealed a handful of withered potatoes and a half-empty jar of preserves. No medical supplies to speak of. She found an old wooden table and cleared it of its dusty contents, transforming it into a makeshift treatment area. The lack of clean water was a serious problem. She located a bucket and ventured back outside, braving the storm to gather fresh snow. Back inside, she placed the bucket near the fireplace and coaxed a small flame to life, using kindling and a few dry logs she could find. "What do you think you're doing?" Jed grumbled, watching her efforts with suspicion. "I can handle this." Elara ignored him, focusing on the task at hand. She needed to clean the wound, stabilize the leg, and get him warm. "You're in no condition to handle anything, Jed. You're hypothermic and have a compound fracture. Now, be quiet and let me work." She ripped a strip of cloth from her own petticoat to use as a bandage. The chill in the room was biting, and she could feel her own fingers growing numb. She knelt beside Jed, gently probing around the break. He hissed in pain, his grip tightening on her arm. "Easy," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "I need to see the extent of the damage." "I don't need your charity, Elara," he spat, his eyes blazing with a feverish light. "I can pay for a real doctor. Just get out of here." Elara sighed, her patience wearing thin. She knew this was the arrogance of a man used to being in control, a man terrified of his own vulnerability. "There is no real doctor within 50 miles, Jed, and even if there was, this storm would keep them away. I'm here to help you. Let me." She met his gaze, her own steady and unwavering. "Or don't, but understand, if I leave, you'll likely freeze to death." He stared at her, the fight slowly draining from his eyes. The pain, the cold, the sheer helplessness of his situation were finally breaking through his bravado. He closed his eyes, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. "Fine," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Do what you have to do." Days of isolation. The wind howled like a banshee, rattling the windows of the small cabin day and night. Elara tended to Jed's burns with a poultice made from crushed herbs and rendered fat, her touch gentle despite the exhaustion etched on her face. His fever broke on the third day, leaving him weak and disoriented. He mumbled apologies, his voice hoarse. "Save your strength," Elara murmured, pressing a cup of snow-melted water to his lips. He drank thirstily, his eyes, still too bright, fixed on her. Days bled into weeks. The blizzard showed no sign of abating. The small world inside the cabin shrank, defined by the crackling fire, the rhythmic drip of melting snow from the eaves, and the constant, oppressive roar of the wind. Jed struggled against his helplessness. He was used to action, to control. Now, confined to the cot, he felt like a trapped animal. He watched Elara move about the cabin, a whirlwind of quiet efficiency. She chopped wood, melted snow, cooked meager meals, and constantly checked on him. Her movements were economical, born of necessity. "Let me help," he croaked one afternoon, attempting to sit up. A wave of dizziness washed over him, and he fell back against the pillows. Elara sighed, her patience fraying. "You need to rest, Jed. You'll only make things worse." "But I can't just lie here while you do everything." His voice was laced with frustration. "You are doing something," she said softly, her gaze meeting his. "You're healing. That's all I need you to do right now." Her words, though meant to soothe, stung. He felt useless, a burden. He wanted to provide, to protect, but he was incapable of doing anything. His wealth, his power, meant nothing here in this desolate place. He was entirely dependent on her. Elara's food supplies dwindled with alarming speed. The root cellar, once stocked with potatoes, carrots, and turnips, was now almost bare. She started rationing their meals, carefully dividing the remaining food. She gave Jed the larger portion, insisting that he needed the nourishment to recover. "You need to eat too, Elara," he protested one evening, pushing some of his stew toward her. The broth was thin, the vegetables sparse. She shook her head, her eyes shadowed. "I'm fine. I had a bigger lunch." He knew she was lying. He had watched her all day. She hadn't eaten more than a handful of dried berries. "Don't," he said, his voice low and strained. "Don't starve yourself for me." Elara avoided his gaze, stirring the fire with a poker. "It's not for you," she said quietly. "It's for both of us. You need to be strong enough to help when the storm finally breaks." He wanted to argue, to demand that she take care of herself, but he knew it would be futile. He saw the resolve in her eyes, the quiet determination that had kept her going through who knew what hardships. He was beginning to understand that Elara Meadowsweet was a force of nature in her own right, as powerful and relentless as the blizzard raging outside. He didn't know how she had survived out here alone for so long, but he found himself wanting to know everything about her. He ate the stew, each bite a reminder of her sacrifice. The taste was bland, almost tasteless, but it filled him with a strange sense of gratitude and unease. He was indebted to her utterly and completely. Melting the ice. The fever yielded on the third day. Jed surfaced from a fog, the vice around his skull loosening its grip. Elara was there, bedside vigil kept, her face bleached by the faint light reflecting off the frosted pane. The shadows beneath her eyes were deep, her posture betraying profound fatigue. "Elara," he croaked, his voice a rusty hinge. Her head shot up, relief painting her features. "Jed, you're awake." Her touch, when she tested his forehead with the back of her hand, was feather-light. "It's broken. The fever's gone, thank heaven." He attempted to sit, but a dizzy spell threatened to swallow him whole. Gently, she pressed him back against the pillow. "Easy, you're still weak. Just rest." The subsequent days found Jed a grateful recipient of Elara's unwavering care. She spoon-fed him broth, diligently changed his dressings, and coaxed him to sip water. He watched her move with a quiet grace, her hands competent and sure as she tended to his injuries. He noticed the faint grimace that flickered across her face as she hauled heavy water buckets, and the raw condition of her hands, chapped and reddened from relentless exposure to the elements. One evening, captivated, Jed observed Elara stirring a simmering pot over the hearth. "Why?" he finally asked, the question lingering in the air. She glanced up, a silent query in her gaze. "Why what, Jed? Why are you doing this? We're strangers. You could have left me for dead out there in the blizzard." Elara's brow furrowed in a frown. "I couldn't. No one should perish alone in the snow." After a thoughtful pause, she continued her stirring. "Besides, I'm a nurse. Tending to the sick is simply what I do." "But you're practically starving yourself," Jed protested, recalling the meager rations she consumed. "You're sacrificing everything to save me." She merely shrugged, a small, dismissive gesture. "I have enough to get by, and you are in need of help." He fell silent, pondering her words. Such selfless devotion was foreign to him. In his world, every act came with strings attached, a concealed motive. He learned early on that kindness was a transaction. But Elara seemed genuinely invested in his well-being. As his strength returned, Elara began to unveil facets of her life. She recounted her work at the town's small clinic, the family she served, and the quiet satisfaction she derived from improving their lives. She spoke of her ambition to erect a larger, more comprehensive clinic capable of attending to the needs of the entire region. Her voice resonated with passionate conviction as she described her patients, a palpable empathy radiating from her. Jed listened, spellbound. His own existence, once overflowing with lavish possessions and fleeting pleasures, suddenly appeared barren and inconsequential. The extravagant galas he had hosted, the opulent attire he had favored, the mountains of food he had squandered, it all felt like a grotesque excess. He had relentlessly pursued the next fleeting thrill, the next acquisition, neglecting the needs of those around him. He'd been so consumed with constructing his personal empire that he'd forgotten the essence of humanity. One afternoon, Elara was outside, splitting wood with practiced swings of the axe. Jed observed her from the window, a novel emotion stirring within him. It wasn't mere gratitude, but something deeper, bordering on profound respect. He registered the resilient power in her arms, the unwavering resolve in her posture, the enduring kindness reflected in her eyes. He recalled his initial interactions with her, the arrogant entitlement that had laced his tone. Shame washed over him like a cold wave. He had treated her like a mere servant, a disposable tool. He had been utterly blind, so completely preoccupied with his own importance that he had failed to recognize the remarkable character standing before him. He knew, with a sudden and startling conviction, that he desired to become a better man. He yearned to prove himself worthy of Elara's compassion, deserving of her friendship. He understood that the path ahead would be arduous. He faced a lifetime of ingrained habits to dismantle, a towering edifice of misdeeds to atone for. But for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Jed Stone experienced a flicker of hope, a nascent possibility. He possessed a newfound purpose now, a compelling reason to transform. He would commence by assisting Elara in realizing her aspirations. The wolves' hunger. The wind carried the sound, a low, mournful lament that vibrated in Elara's bones. It wasn't the wind itself. She'd spent enough years in these mountains to know the difference. It was wolves. Close. She stopped mending the tear in Jed's riding blanket, needle poised mid-air. Jed, who was awkwardly attempting to chop firewood, a task that still ended more often with him swearing than with neatly stacked logs, paused, axe raised high. "What is it?" he asked, his voice tight. He'd heard it too. "Wolves," Elara said, her gaze sweeping the darkening horizon. The sun was sinking, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of bruised purple and angry orange. Beautiful, but a chilling beauty tonight. "They sound hungry." He lowered the axe, the thud muffled by the snow. "Hungry enough to come after livestock? Hungry enough to come after anything," Elara said grimly. She'd seen the aftermath of a wolf pack driven by desperation. It wasn't pretty. "We need to secure the animals, reinforce the fences," and she trailed off, thinking. Jed was still weak. She was no warrior. "And what?" he prompted, his eyes mirroring her worry. "And pray," she finished softly. The next hour was a flurry of activity. Elara led the horses and the few chickens she had into the barn, double-latching the heavy wooden door. Jed, surprisingly, didn't complain about his aching ribs as he helped reinforce the fencing around the small paddock where she kept her goats. He moved slower than usual, each breath a little ragged, but he didn't stop. "I never thought I'd be so grateful for a few chickens," he muttered, hammering a loose post back into place. Elara managed a small smile. "They're good layers. And company." Back inside the cabin, she bolted the door and barred the windows. Jed loaded the rifle, his hands steady despite the tremor she could see in his jaw. He might have lived a pampered life, but he wasn't a coward. The howling grew louder as darkness fell, closer now, circling. It was a chorus of hunger, a primal song of need that sent shivers down Elara's spine. The horses in the barn whinnied nervously. "They're testing us," Jed said, his voice low. He stood by the window, rifle held loosely but ready. "Seeing how strong our defenses are." Suddenly, a frantic bleating shattered the night. The goats. The fence hadn't held. "No," Elara cried, grabbing her coat. "Elara, no. It's too dangerous," Jed protested, his voice laced with panic. "They're my goats, Jed. They won't stand a chance." She grabbed a thick, heavy branch she used for kindling. It was a poor weapon, but it was all she had. She threw open the door and plunged into the frigid night. The snow crunched under her boots as she ran towards the paddock, the wolves' howls reaching a fever pitch. She could see them now, shadowy figures moving in the darkness, their eyes gleaming like embers. A large gray wolf lunged at one of the goats, its teeth bared. Elara screamed and charged, swinging the branch with all her might. She connected with the wolf's flank, sending it yelping backwards. The goats scattered, bleeding in terror. But there were too many. Suddenly, a shot rang out, echoing through the valley. One of the wolves dropped, whining. Jed stood silhouetted in the doorway of the cabin, rifle smoking. He fired again, and another wolf fell. The remaining wolves hesitated, their hunger warring with their fear. They circled, their eyes fixed on Elara and Jed. Then, with a final, mournful howl, they disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind the scent of blood and fear. Elara stood panting, her heart pounding in her chest. She looked at Jed, who was leaning heavily against the doorframe, his face pale and strained. "You came," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He pushed himself upright, wincing. "Couldn't let you face them alone, could I?" He managed a weak smile. Besides, those goats looked tasty. Elara ran to him, relief flooding through her. She wanted to hug him, to thank him, but she stopped herself. Instead, she just looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Jed," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved them and me." He met her gaze, his own eyes surprisingly clear. "We saved them, Elara. Together." Breaking through. The wind surrendered, not in a drawn-out sigh, but with the decisive snap of a celestial circuit breaker. One moment, the cabin shuddered, a plaything of the tempest. The next, a disquieting stillness blanketed everything, as dense and smothering as the snowdrift against the door. Elara, perpetually alert, registered the shift first. Pausing in her tending of the hearth, her movements usually so measured and deliberate, she tilted her head, listening. "Quiet," she murmured, her voice struggling to rise above the fire's murmur. Jed, recuperating on a makeshift bed of furs, his leg finally strong enough to support him, strained to discern the change. The storm's incessant clamor had been the backdrop to their lives for days. Its sudden departure felt ominous. Then he caught it, a delicate, pulsing beat growing with each second. A chopper, a surge of hope, brilliant and keen, cut through the weariness that had become his constant companion. He pushed himself upright, gritting his teeth against the stab of pain, and limped toward the window. Through the frosted glass, a murky shape materialized against the lightening sky. "Rescue," he rasped, his voice raw. Elara's response was understated. No jubilant leap, no headlong rush to the exit. Instead, she turned, her features an enigma in the dimness. Ready to leave? The question snagged in his throat. Ready? Could he embrace a life of luxurious confinement and hollow pleasantries, where every desire was met, but his spirit remained starved? The helicopter touched down a short distance away, its rotors churning the snow into a blinding vortex. Figures swathed in high-visibility orange disembarked, their faces hidden behind protective gear. Elara pulled the door open, inviting a gust of icy air. One of the team, a woman with a compassionate gaze, approached them swiftly. "You sent the distress signal?" she called, her voice muffled. Elara confirmed. "He's injured." She indicated Jed with a nod. The rescuer's eyes assessed him. "We need to get you to a hospital for evaluation. Can you ambulate?" "I can manage," Jed replied, his gaze drawn back to Elara. A strange reluctance held him, a powerful tether unrelated to his physical condition. As the team readied a gurney, Jed found himself alone with Elara once more. The air thrummed with unspoken sentiments. "I owe you," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. "You saved me." Elara dismissed his words with a shrug, her gaze averted. Anyone would have done the same. He reached for her hand, his fingers closing around hers. Her skin was rough, bearing the marks of physical labor, yet her touch was surprisingly comforting. "I'm not sure I would have," he confessed, the words barely audible. "Not before." His gaze swept over the cabin, taking in the rustic walls, the simple furnishings, the fire that had sustained them. It was a world away from the lavish estates he knew, yet resonated with a sense of belonging he'd never experienced. Returning his attention to Elara, he saw a quiet fortitude etched on her face, which both humbled and entranced him. He realized, with a conviction that resonated deep within, that he couldn't abandon her. Not yet. Not ever if fate allowed. "I'm not leaving," he declared, his voice resolute. Elara's eyes widened, surprise flickering within their depths. "What?" "I'm staying," he reiterated. "Here with you." The rescue team was nearing, their expressions quizzical. Jed inhaled deeply, bracing himself for the inevitable barrage of questions, challenges, disbelief. But he was prepared. His path was clear. He addressed the lead rescuer. "Thank you for your assistance," he stated. "However, I've decided to remain. My injury is no longer a concern. You can stand down." The rescuer scowled, clearly taken aback. "Are you certain? We can provide comprehensive medical care." Jed affirmed with a nod, his gaze unwavering. "I'm certain." The most potent remedy I require is already present. He tightened his grip on Elara's hand, his eyes locking with hers. He saw the shadow of apprehension recede, replaced by the dawn of a hesitant smile. The world outside dissolved, leaving only them, bathed in the gentle, burgeoning light. A new foundation. The thwack-thwack of rotor blades shattered the mountain village's habitual serenity. Elara squinted against the sudden gale, a tumult of anticipation and trepidation roiling inside her. Jed's assurances of aid were now dwarfed by this spectacle, a veritable catalyst for transformation. The helicopter touched down in the clearing he'd fashioned near the clinic, kicking up dust devils around the secured cargo beneath. Jed, already on the ground, orchestrated the unloading with a newfound confidence that, while still unfamiliar, radiated intent. He wasn't snapping commands. He was guiding, clarifying, ensuring each item was handled with care. Crates of medicine, a generator pulsating with latent power, even sections for a clinic annex. The sheer scale stunned her. "Jed, this is far too much," she started, but he interjected, his gaze unwavering. "I wanted to Elara. I vowed it." He indicated a group of men wrestling with planks. "They're starting on the latrines. Basic hygiene has been neglected for too long." The ensuing weeks became a whirlwind of activity. Surprisingly handy, Jed labored alongside the villagers, hoisting, hammering, and perspiring under the implacable sun. He embraced the grime, swapping tailored shirts for simple cotton ones, stained with sweat and the scent of the earth. Before the winter's onslaught, he reinforced roofs, prioritizing the most vulnerable homes. He devised a system to channel fresh spring water, easing the burden on the village women. Elara observed him almost constantly, a blend of incredulity and burgeoning admiration blossoming within her. He was still Jed, the same stubborn resolve etched on his face, the occasional glint of impatience in his eyes, but something profound had been reforged. The compulsion to dominate had yielded to a desire to serve. One evening, after a back-breaking day mending a breached irrigation channel, they sat by the babbling creek. The air, alive with the aroma of pine and damp soil, held a bracing chill. "Thank you, Jed," Elara murmured, watching the fireflies ignite the twilight. "For everything you've done." He faced her, the flickering flames mirrored in his eyes. "I owe you my gratitude, Elara. You revealed to me what holds true value." He reached into his pocket, not for a gem, but a small, intricately wrought wooden bird. Imperfect, obviously handcrafted, yet its detail was remarkable. One of the villagers carved it. He explained, his voice a resonant murmur. He said it represents hope and the dawn of new possibilities. "I wish to gift it to you." He paused, inhaled deeply, then his voice thick with emotion continued. "Elara, I arrived here lost and shattered. You healed me, not just physically, but in ways I couldn't have imagined. I was a self-centered man, accustomed to taking my fill. Now, all I yearn for is to reciprocate, to assist others as you do, and I wish to embark on this journey with you." He knelt then, not in a theatrical flourish, but simply, humbly, on the mossy bank. "My words might lack finesse, Elara, and I won't pledge riches or an easy path, but I can vow this. I will strive each day to craft a life alongside you, a life devoted to uplifting others, a life brimming with purpose and meaning. Will you become my wife, Elara? Not for my wealth, but for our shared vision." Elara's breath hitched. Tears blurred her vision, softening the image of the earnest, transformed man before her. It wasn't the proposal she ever envisioned, but it resonated with authenticity. It was them distilled. "Yes, Jed," she breathed, her voice trembling with emotion. "Yes, I will." The haven of Stone Meadow. The acceptance flew from Elara's lips before Jed even finished the question, a joyous sound that echoed across the snow-dusted fields. He caught her up in a hug so fierce she could barely breathe, the scent of pine and something indefinably Jed filling her senses. For the first time in years, she felt completely, utterly, undeniably safe. The wedding was a patchwork affair, a testament to the community they'd unwittingly fostered. Miss Abigail baked a towering cake, its layers held together with more hope than frosting. Silas, surprisingly handy with a guitar, provided the music, his calloused fingers coaxing out melodies that made even the stoic Mrs. Gable tap her foot. Jed wore a suit that looked distinctly uncomfortable, the stiff fabric a stark contrast to his usual worn leather, while Elara donned a simple dress of cream-colored wool, borrowed from Martha, the seamstress's wife. Wildflowers, stubbornly blooming even in the late autumn chill, adorned her hair. As they stood before the makeshift altar, fashioned from reclaimed barnwood, Elara looked out at the faces. Weathered farmers, shy children clinging to their mother's skirts, even a few of Jed's former ranch hands who'd traveled miles to be there. They were a motley crew, united by need and now by joy. She saw not just faces, but stories etched in wrinkles and calloused hands, stories she was now part of. Jed squeezed her hand, his gaze meeting hers, a silent promise passing between them. He looked different, softer around the edges, the arrogance replaced by a quiet strength, a deep-seated contentment. The vows were short, heartfelt, and punctuated by the occasional sniffle from the audience. When Jed slipped the simple gold band onto her finger, it felt like a weight settling into place, anchoring her to this life, to this man, to this purpose. The celebration that followed was a blur of laughter, shared food, and awkward dancing. Jed, surprisingly, wasn't half bad on the dance floor, his large frame surprisingly nimble. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Elara leaned against him, content. "So," she said, a playful glint in her eyes, "what now, Mr. Stone?" He chuckled, wrapping his arm around her. "Now, Mrs. Stone, we get to work." And work they did. The transformation of the ranch was gradual, organic. It started with clearing out a few extra rooms, offering shelter to a family displaced by a fire. Then came the makeshift clinic in the old tack room, where Elara treated minor injuries and dispensed what few medicines she had. Word spread, carried on the wind, and whispered from neighbor to neighbor. Soon, the ranch was a beacon, a safe haven for those who had nowhere else to turn. Jed, to everyone's astonishment, embraced the change. He sold off a portion of his land, using the money to buy supplies, medicine, and food. He learned to mend fences alongside the men he used to boss around, to plant vegetables with the women who'd once only known him as the aloof owner. He even learned to deliver a calf, a messy, chaotic experience that left him covered in mud and surprisingly proud. He still wore his Stetson, but was often tilted back on his head, his brow furrowed in concentration as he listened to Elara explain the intricacies of wound care or helped a child with their reading. Elara, meanwhile, blossomed. The weight of loneliness that had burdened her for so long lifted, replaced by a sense of purpose that fueled her every action. She still worked tirelessly, often to the point of exhaustion, but now she wasn't alone. Jed was always there, a steady presence, offering a strong shoulder to lean on, a warm meal, and a gentle reminder to rest. They worked side by side, their differences complementing each other. Jed's pragmatism balanced Elara's idealism. His strength supported her compassion. They argued, of course, about everything from the best way to mend a roof to the proper dosage of a certain medicine. But their disagreements were always rooted in a shared desire to help. One evening, after a particularly long day spent tending to a sick child, they sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge. Jed took her hand, his calloused fingers tracing the lines of her palm. "You know," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "we need to name this place." Elara smiled. "I thought you liked calling it the Stone Ranch." He shook his head. "That was before. This is different. It's more than just my name now." He paused, looking out at the sprawling fields, bathed in the silver glow of the moon. "It's a haven, a place of healing, a meadow of stone." And so, it became known as Stone Meadow, a testament to their love, their compassion, and the transformative power of second chances. It was a place where the lost found refuge, the broken found healing, and where two unlikely souls found each other, forging a love story as enduring as the land itself. Their lives were far from easy. The needs were endless, but they faced it together, hand in hand, knowing that even in the darkest of winters, hope could blossom in the most unexpected places.